My first attempts at adding color to glass were a complete disaster, and I thought this video would be my first fail. My second attempt was a success, so let me show you all the products you can use and the simple ways you can color miniature glass. I'll be adding color to some miniature glass jars, these really cool glass spheres that are hollow in the center, and tiny mason jars. Up first, I'm diluting some Diamond Glaze. You can dilute this product up to 50% with water. I'm combining the mixture in a silicone cupcake liner and adding half to another liner so I can make two colors. For my color, I'm using red India ink. From 2 hours of crafting during my initial try, this was one of the only successful attempts. I poured it inside the bottle, spun it around for full coverage, and let it dry. Maybe the result would have been more vibrant had I used more ink, but I'm very impressed with this method. Up next, I'm using some pouring medium I got at the Dollar Tree. You can mix a product like this in with some acrylic paint and pour it over canvases or other surfaces to make swirly art. I'm using this mixture inside of this miniature mason jar. This color turned out a lot darker than I intended, but it ends up looking like cobalt glass, so I'll call this another success from day one. It was opaque, but it dried transparent with no streaks. The rest of the pieces from day one turned out looking like not good, so let me tell you what not to do. For the failures from day one, I used Elmer's glue, Diamond Glaze, and Mod Podge. For each of the different products, I used acrylic paint to color them. I thinned the mixture with water and poured it on the inside of all the bottles. All the pieces looked pretty great while they were still wet, so imagine my surprise when I check them the next morning and all I can see is splotchy weirdness and paint pigments all over the inside of the glass. I also tried pouring watered down glass paint into the jars, and that turned out worst of all. The only pieces that had turned out right were the pouring medium, which is meant to be mixed with acrylic paint, and the Diamond Glaze I mixed with ink. I realized the solid components of the acrylic paint were causing major problems, so I plopped all the pieces into a jar of warm water, rinsed them out, and started over again. Fortunately, the paint was easy to remove with some warm water and Q-tips. Now that we're getting a fresh start, I'll show you the few different techniques I used to finally succeed and add some color to glass. I'm adding color to the outside this time, so I used a hot glue gun to attach my glass pieces to the end of a pencil to temporarily hold them. For pieces without a flat bottom, I stuck them on the pointed end of the pencil with hot glue. India ink worked really well for adding color to the glass, but since many of you probably don't have it, we'll be using regular old food coloring. To fulfill my blue mason jar dreams, I'm adding some blue food coloring to some Elmer's glue. I'm coating the outside of the jar, making sure to work pretty quickly because you don't want this to start setting up on you. For each of the pieces, I applied the paint on camera and then brought the jar closer to my face to give it a smoother, less streaky appearance. For my second piece, I'm using a bit of green food coloring to slightly alter the first blue color. The glass spheres remind me of fishing floats, so I'm painting them in nautical colors. The Elmer's glue food dye combo gives a cloudy appearance that kind of looks like sea glass, but the color is nice and even. I wanted to see if this technique works on plastic, so I painted the Elmer's glue and food dye mixture onto a plastic vase I got from Temu. It doesn't quite pass as glass, but it looks pretty good. Up next, we're trying some Diamond Glaze to mix with the food dye. Right out the gate, I could tell the Diamond Glaze would give a much more transparent result than the Elmer's glue. I can easily see the pencil inside of the sphere, but I can also see tiny bubbles. I realized if you mix in the dye more carefully, you'll incorporate much less bubbles than I did my first attempt. If you'd like to create bubble glass on purpose, I think the Diamond Glaze would be good for you. I managed to avoid bubbles when I mixed up a new blue color for my mini mason jar. I painted one mason jar with Elmer's glue and one with the Diamond Glaze. Now we're trying some matte Mod Podge, which is something a lot of us have. I also have gloss Mod Podge, but mine is pretty chunky and not in great shape, so I'm using matte. The matte Mod Podge dries matte, as you might expect, although not as matte as the Elmer's glue. Here's a quick comparison to show how the green matte Mod Podge is actually less matte than the blue Elmer's glue. It creates an even application, and I can show you how to make it more see-through later. To get a richer color, I coated this jar with 2 layers of the Mod Podge. I ended up overworking it as the Mod Podge was drying, so it turned out a bit streaky. Mixing glass paint with water did not work well at all, so now I'm just using it straight out of the tube. I'm squeezing the tube all over to mix it up before I use it. The glass paint straight from the tube applies nice and evenly. I painted this piece with brown, hoping to get a dark amber brown color like this bottle. To get a darker result, I used the darker paint that's available in my set. I wonder if the paints ended up in the wrong tube because the supposedly darker color is way lighter. It dries really quickly, so I gave the smaller jar a second coat to deepen the color. I painted a jar with dark blue to see how that looked, and it also turned out extremely subtle. For a dark blue color, you should go with the pouring medium acrylic mixture I used in my first day of crafting. Up next, we're using one of my newest products, which is Triple Thick. This is a brilliant brush-on gloss glaze. Since the product is so thick, it's easier to avoid creating bubbles when adding the color. This product was most similar to the Diamond Glaze, which gave a shiny, transparent, colorful coat. I didn't use as much dye, so the color is lighter, but there are no bubbles. The color is sitting perfectly on top of the glass and really looks like it's always been that way. Out of curiosity, I wanted to see what would happen if I brushed the dye directly onto glass. At first, the dye didn't want to sit on the surface, but after a few brush strokes, it coated it very nicely. To transform my 2 blue mason jars into ball jars, I'm writing the word ball across the front using some Diamond Glaze in a precision tip bottle. Unfortunately, the Diamond Glaze hardens in the needle tip, so after I use this, I'll return it to the bottle and rinse it out. Off camera, I did my best to write the word ball on the Elmer's glue jar. The centers of the B and the A filled, so I used a skinny brush to try to tidy it up. It worked pretty well and looks decently okay, but I developed a better technique for the second jar. To make it shinier and more see-through, I coated the whole thing in Diamond Glaze. For the Diamond Glaze colored jar, I used a paintbrush to paint the word ball directly onto the glass. To make your Elmer's glue and matte Mod Podge pieces look more transparent, you can coat them with Diamond Glaze. I added a coat of Diamond Glaze to most of the Mod Podge and Elmer's glue pieces. Check out my Patreon where you can sign up as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. You can watch this next video to see how I finished up the abandoned miniature lab inside of a book. Thank you for watching and for all of your comments.